It's now emerged that Erik Ten Hag refused to take questions from a number of journalists after the win over Sheffield United in midweek. And these were journalists who he perceived were critical of him in a certain way, and I'll get to that. During and after Manchester United's dramatic Wembley collapse and then win against Coventry at the weekend, you'll probably recall that there were headlines and one or two people mentioned to him post-match at Wembley that maybe he was embarrassed about what had happened to United on the day, that there had been a collapse and then it led to a penalty shootout which United won. So was that the fashion, ideally, that he would like to have seen his team get to the final eventually against Manchester City? Now, fast forward then to the other night, after they beat Sheffield United. There were journalists in the media auditorium, but certain of them were not invited to question Ten Hag after the 4-2 win over Sheffield United, because they were the ones who, it's alleged, were suggesting the way they got to the final was embarrassing, and Ten Hag wasn't having that. Now, Mike McGrath, a well-respected journalist with the Daily Telegraph, he's written about this, and I asked him more about this earlier this morning.
Yeah, it came apparent after the game on Wednesday, which I was covering from the for the Telegraph, that Ten Hag, he wasn't taking questions from certain journalists. Now, on the headline, it does say critical of United's form, but actually in the article, it does read, what I've reported is that Ten Hag has felt that some of the reporters that cover United have crossed the line with their coverage and opinions of him and his position at United, and he didn't want to take questions from them after that 4-2 win against Sheffield United, which really brings up the debate or whether it's right, really, whether you should kind of pick and choose who you want to answer questions from if you don't like what's being said.
And in his eyes, some of the things that some of those journalists said were disrespectful, hence he didn't want to engage with them, presumably.
That's right. I think from what I understand and just following up the story afterwards was that it's been some of the coverage about what's said about his job and also what was kind of tweeted or posted mid-match in the Coventry Man United game, which they obviously collapsed dramatically in, but Ten Hag argued, well, they did win the game, they did get through to the final, but certainly felt that some of that opinion crossed the line, and that was the reason behind his decision.
Just to be clear, those who he felt had been disrespectful were not invited to put any kind of point to him and had to sit there mute until the end of the news conference. Yeah,
that's what happened on Wednesday night, and that was our follow-up report on the Telegraph website yesterday to the match against Sheffield United.
So that was Mike McGrath, Simon, football reporter of the Daily Telegraph. Mike, thanks for your time with that. So it seems from that, Simon, you can only ask Ten Hag something if he likes the way you ask it.
No, I don't think that's a fair characterisation, Jim. I think that the media and certain sections of the media don't have a God-given right to ask certain questions or to be afforded the opportunity to ask certain questions. And narratives get created by the media. Do I think it's advisable? Do I think it's advisable to shut down them so they can be even more vociferous in their condemnation of you? Possibly not. But I've had this issue. I had this issue when Simon Greenberg was the editor of the Evening Standard and went on to be Chelsea's head of communications, telling me about my football club. So I banned him because I got fed up with the way they were behaving. I remember watching Alan Sugar struggle with the press over the battle between him and Venables and him and potentially George Graham, because certain sections of the press, the Mail and Jeff Powell, were very friendly with certain people and they created a narrative. Watch Todd Bowley. Watch the media narrative around Todd Bowley and the fact he's an idiot American, doesn't know what he's doing, and he'll carry that with him for some time. So narratives get created by newspapers. So I understand why you go, I tell you what, if that's the way you want to play this game, if you want to paraphrase words and stick embarrassing in front of me and get me to bite down on the word embarrassing so you can create headlines off it, then you're not a journalist that I particularly want to talk to. So it reminds the press that they don't have a God-given right. If the press had their way, they'd pick the England team, they'd pick the England manager, they'd tell you what everything's wrong with society without actually providing any solutions. So I make him right, but I try and put myself in that position and think to myself, would I let some saucy sod journalist try and create a situation with me where I couldn't deal with him and gave him that level of power that he felt that he was being excluded because it was that important? But that's me, and not a huge PR mechanism like Manchester United that feels...
but what's the point of it? In December, United banned 4 media outlets with Ten Hag saying that they were not given a right of reply to negative stories about the club. And those were people from Sky, ESPN...
What's the point of it?
The Manchester Evening News and the Mirror. They were excluded.
To remind the press... Because I remember, again, using Simon Greenberg as an example, he told me that the results and the performance of Crystal Palace were often shaped by the newspaper reporting, for which I nearly spat my dummy across the room, because actually you're reporting the results that we do. You're bugger all to do with the outcome. It's reminding the press that they are a cog on the wheel, that they're part of the equation. They aren't the equation. And so when they get ahead of themselves with opinions, what the press writes, like all of us, and we sit here the same, is an opinion. It ain't a fact. And so if you don't want to deal with a certain section of the press because you don't want to, you don't have to explain it to them. They're there by consent, not by right. So I don't blame them for doing it, because I think that they crossed the line. I do think they crossed the line by trying to force a narrative into Ten Hag's mouth about the embarrassment he must have felt about that performance. Because the moment he cops to that, the back page of the newspapers would be Manchester United manager says players are embarrassing.
But all he says is, I don't think it was embarrassing.
Jim,
we've got to a final.
Could I speak here just a minute?
And I think he probably did, didn't he?
Yeah.
Would it? I mean, I can't quite understand. Wasn't it embarrassing, though, what happened in the game against Coventry? Because every game that you play against Manchester United, you're in that game. They're so open, and maybe his time should be spent on, realistic analysis of his own team.
I think that's fair.
So when you're sat in a press conference and you sit there, and you almost sounds like there's a dishonesty. He's feeding lines. He's creating a narrative about his team, trying to create a positive, which for your own eyes, you watch it, you say, what is he talking about? So after a while, these journalists think, well, okay, let's pose the question. No, we'll tell him what we can see. And it ain't good enough. It's disappointing. It's embarrassing. And of course now he throws people out. So those that can see the picture, those that can see what's really there and what isn't there that he's trying to pretend, get thrown out of the press conference. For me, that's poor.
And that's an alternate view, and I understand the validity of that as well. But with the greatest respect in the world, the newspapers aren't trying to serve an interest that's motivated by anything other than creating headlines and opportunities.
That's their job.
And I understand that, and that's the dichotomy that we have to deal with, which is the challenges of what newspapers sell, because if it bleeds, it leads, right? So we don't want good news, we want bad news.
You asked John Terry some questions this week, some of which you maybe didn't fancy, but you still asked them anyway. Why did you do that? Because it was the right thing to do. Yes,
but I didn't try and frame it in a certain way to elicit a response that was ultimately based upon my motivation.
But Ten Hag's a big boy.
And I understand that. And that's why I'm balancing the point between my view. I would have taken the bait and I would have gone after these journalists like Nigel Pearson did years ago, when he basically said to a bunch of journalists, get your ostrich heads out of the ground, you don't know what you're talking about. And then the media have got the pen. Once they've got the pen, they've got the sword, right? And ultimately they can put you to it. So you can't win. So best way to do it is do what possibly you said from the outset, which is, no, I don't think it's embarrassing. But they won't leave it there, because they'll go, well, it was. Well, I don't think it was. Well, it was because United were 3-0 up. But so you can't win this debate, because they'll never end that debate, because they like
but in
that
every
word
press conference you
embarrassing.
listen to, you're hearing something that's completely different to what you've seen when you watch Manchester United from the manager. And you actually think, is he competent enough to do this job? Because what he's saying is not reality.
They
is
won
what I'm seeing
the
on the
game.
Pitch. So is it propaganda? Is he feeding lines? So the media are right to say, look, sorry, no, we'll point it out to you because it is disappointing.
But is managing the press...
How did Coventry get back into that game?
Is managing the press propaganda? Because the motivation behind the press is to create
from above?
Interest.
Are there people there? Is there Sir Alex
PR.
Ferguson influence?
It's PR.
I'm seeing certain people that used to be there. Are they saying, no, get them out of the press conference?
Well,
I think it's a little bit late for that.
We'll see what happens in the 90 minutes during Burnley at the weekend there at Old Trafford. And then we'll hear what Eric's got to say after that.
On AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.